I never imagined that buying my dream home would turn into a nightmare. The HOA, an organization I thought would help maintain order in the neighborhood, became a real nightmare instead. Karen Reed, the new president, not only imposed unreasonable rules, but also found every way to interfere with my private life. From trivial violations to threatening to demolish my legally built guest house, all because she wanted to assert her personal power. The HOA was no longer a place to maintain harmony, but a tool for control and abuse of power. If you're interested in dramatic stories about power, corruption, and the battle to protect the community, don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you won't miss any updates. I had finally purchased my dream home in Oak Estates. It wasn't just a house. It was everything I had ever dreamed of. The place had a charming guest house, legally built 20 years ago by the previous owner. It had all the necessary permits and was exactly what I needed for my aging parents, who visited frequently. My parents would stay there whenever they came to see me, and the layout was perfect for them. The guest house had been grandfathered into the community's rules, so I didn't expect any trouble. At first, everything was peaceful. I kept my lawn pristine, never left trash cans out overnight, and even participated in the neighborhood's annual cleanup. I was the model resident. No complaints, no issues. Little did I know, this perfect life was about to be shattered by someone who would make my peaceful existence a living nightmare. Then, Karen Reed became the new HOA president. I didn't know much about her at first, but it didn't take long to realize she was the kind of person who thought of herself as the community's self-appointed sheriff. She had a vision for the neighborhood, but it was a vision that only suited her. Oak Estates, one of the best-maintained neighborhoods in the county, didn't need any restoring, but Karen saw a problem where none existed. I first met Karen when she stopped by my house one Saturday morning. I was washing my car, minding my own business, when she approached. With her overdone smile and her perfectly manicured nails, she introduced herself. "Hi, I'm Karen Reed, the new HOA president," she said, acting like I should already know who she was. She went on about her plans for the neighborhood, talking about how we needed cohesive aesthetics and how the place was somehow declining. I remember feeling uneasy, but I simply nodded and let her talk. I had no idea then that this meeting would set the stage for the nightmare to come. Her smile was fake, and the way she looked me up and down made it clear that she saw herself as someone in control. It was like she had already marked me as someone who needed to be taught a lesson, but I didn't let her see my discomfort. I just nodded and continued washing my car. What else could I do? 2 weeks later, the first violation notice arrived. I was shocked to find that my bird feeder was unsanctioned, and I had to remove it. It was a small thing, but it was the beginning. I did what was asked, thinking it was a one-off mistake. The next week, another violation. My garage door wasn't the right shade of beige. I had followed the exact color code from the HOA handbook, but I repainted it anyway, just to avoid more trouble. Then came the letter about the guest house. It was the final straw. The HOA claimed that my guest house violated the Oak Estates Covenant, Section 7.3, and that I had 30 days to remove it or face daily fines of $200. I was stunned. This wasn't just some shed thrown together. It was a proper legal guest house that had been built 20 years ago with full permits. My parents were staying there, and my mother's mobility issues made it the perfect setup. I immediately called Karen, trying to stay calm. When she picked up, I tried to explain. "Karen, this is a mistake. The guest house was built with permits 20 years ago, and it's protected under the grandfather clause," I said, my voice tight. But Karen's response was cold and dismissive, almost like she was enjoying the situation. "Well, Ethan, the board has reviewed your situation, and we've determined that the previous HOA administration was too lenient. Your guest house disrupts the community's aesthetic and property values," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "This doesn't make any sense," I said, fighting to keep my temper in check. "The structure is legally protected. This isn't about rules. It's about your personal preference." She laughed in my ear. "Well, Ethan, the board's decision is final. If you want to dispute it, go ahead. But we're moving forward with this." I quickly realized that this wasn't about enforcing rules. This was about Karen's personal vendetta. She was using her position to target people she didn't like. She didn't like my guest house, and she didn't like the way it looked in the neighborhood, so she was going to do everything she could to have it removed. But I wasn't the only one. I spoke to some neighbors and found out Karen had been sending violation notices to newer residents, many of whom didn't fully understand their rights under the HOA covenant. One neighbor had been fined for a vegetable garden that had been in place for 8 years. Another had received a notice for a basketball hoop that was explicitly permitted by the covenant. Karen wasn't enforcing the rules. She was selectively punishing people who didn't fit her ideal image of the neighborhood. And it was all starting to feel personal. It wasn't long before things escalated even further. I came home one afternoon to find a demolition notice taped to the door of my guest house. My parents, who were inside, were visibly shaken. They explained that Karen had come over with 2 men claiming to be from the county building department, and they had told them that the structure was condemned and would be demolished in 7 days. I was furious. "This is illegal," I said, trying to keep my voice steady as I put my arm around my mother. "They can't do this." I immediately called the real county building department. To my shock, there was no condemnation order for my property. The men who had come by weren't from the county. They were just part of Karen's scheme to intimidate us. This wasn't just overreach. This was fraud and harassment. I gathered all my documents, including the original building permits and the grandfather clause, and set up security cameras. But Karen wasn't going to back down. She had no idea who she was messing with, and she was about to find out the hard way. The tension in Oak Estates was palpable. I had hoped that Karen's initial violation notices were just a misunderstanding, but it was becoming clear that this was part of a larger pattern. Every day, something new. A complaint about my lawn. A complaint about my mailbox. It felt like Karen was just looking for reasons to target me. And the worst part? I wasn't alone. Other neighbors were complaining about the same thing. Karen wasn't just trying to enforce the rules. She was using her position to control everyone around her, especially those who dared to challenge her perfect neighborhood. My phone buzzed with another violation notice. This time, it was for the tree in my front yard. Apparently, it had grown too tall and was blocking the view from a neighbor's window. I couldn't believe it. "This is ridiculous," I muttered to myself, staring at the letter. What was next? Would she tell me to cut my grass shorter or paint my house a different color? I called Karen, but her tone was all sweetness mixed with venom. "Ethan, I understand you're upset," she said, the fake sympathy in her voice clear as day. "But you know the rules. Your tree is just too tall, and we can't have that. It's disrupting the aesthetic of the community." "You've got to be kidding me," I replied, frustration boiling in my chest. "It's a tree, Karen. It's not hurting anyone. This is just another one of your petty power plays." She let out a soft laugh. "Well, if you can't comply with the rules, then perhaps Oak Estates just isn't the place for you." That was it. I was done. I wasn't going to let her push me around any longer. Then it happened. I came home to find a demolition notice on my guest house. My parents were inside, and Karen, with her usual smirk, had somehow convinced some random people to come to my house and try to tear it down. She was going too far. "Ethan, they said they have orders to demolish it," my father told me, his voice tight with anger. My mother stood nearby, tears welling in her eyes. "They said it's condemned." I was furious. I called the county building department, only to find out that no such order existed. Karen had crossed the line from just being annoying to flat out illegal. She had lied, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. I stormed outside, furious. I saw the crew getting ready to destroy my property, with Karen standing by, arms crossed, a smug look on her face. "What are you doing?" I yelled, planting myself between the machinery and my guest house. Karen, with her fake politeness, shot back. "This is HOA business, Ethan. The board voted to demolish this illegal structure. You were given notice. This is not just HOA business, Karen. This is fraud." I shouted. "You don't have the legal authority to do this. I'll make sure you regret this." She barely even flinched. "I've got everything in order. The board supports me, and that's all that matters." At that moment, I realized I was done trying to reason with her. Karen wasn't interested in the truth. She was on a power trip, and she wasn't going to stop unless someone with real power stepped in. That's when I did something I never thought I would do. I reached for my phone and called Mark Johnson. I had worked with him on a project before, but this felt like crossing a line. Still, I had no choice. My parents were in that guest house, and Karen had gone too far. When Mark Johnson answered, I felt a surge of relief. Ethan, how's the retrofit holding up? He asked, his voice casual. I quickly cut him off. It's fine, but that's not why I'm calling. I have an HOA president attempting to illegally demolish my guest house with my parents inside. The police are calling it a civil matter, but this is fraud, plain and simple. They're trying to destroy my property. There was a long pause on the other end. Put me on speaker, he said, his voice suddenly serious. I did as instructed, holding the phone out so that Karen and the demolition crew could hear. This is Mark Johnson, he said, his voice authoritative and firm. Who am I speaking with regarding this demolition? Karen's eyes widened, and her mouth opened and closed. She stammered, I'm Karen Reed, HOA president of Oak Estates. Mark Johnson wasted no time. I've worked with Ethan Davis. If he says this structure is legal, then I trust him. I find it disturbing that you're attempting to destroy property without proper authority. Are you aware this could constitute criminal property damage? Karen's face drained of color. What? She whispered, her voice trembling. You heard me, Mark Johnson continued, his tone unwavering. I will be making calls to the county commissioner and the state attorney general's office. I suggest you stop this demolition immediately. It was as if the world stood still. Karen's smugness evaporated, and the demolition crew froze in place, not sure what to do. The sound of the machinery slowly died down. Karen stood there, her clipboard clutched to her chest, staring at the ground, speechless. In less than an hour, the entire neighborhood knew what had happened. Whispers started spreading like wildfire. By the time evening rolled around, an emergency HOA meeting had been called. Karen's facade had finally cracked, and everyone was starting to see her for what she truly was, an overbearing tyrant abusing her power. The next week was a whirlwind. Legal action was underway, with the county commissioner launching an investigation into Karen's actions. The state attorney general's office sent a representative to review how the HOA had been operating under her leadership. Karen, who had prided herself on her iron grip on the community, was now facing the consequences of her overreach. At the emergency HOA meeting, the evidence against Karen mounted. It was clear that she had acted unilaterally, making decisions on her own without board approval. She had falsified documents, collected fines under questionable circumstances, and harassed residents for personal reasons. One by one, neighbors stood up to share their stories of harassment. Karen fined me for having a garden gnome, one man said. She made me take it down, even though it wasn't violating anything. Another neighbor spoke up. Karen forced me to remove my playground equipment because it wasn't aesthetically pleasing. The room was growing louder, voices full of anger and frustration. Finally, it was my turn to speak. I didn't need to embellish anything. The truth was damning enough. I presented the facts, the legal status of my guest house, the fraudulent condemnation notice, and the attempted demolition. Karen, who had once been so confident, was now sitting at the front, her face turning redder with each passing minute. She tried to defend herself, but it was too late. The board voted unanimously to remove her from the HOA and to pursue legal action for fraud and harassment. As Karen stormed out of the room, she muttered, "You'll regret this. You'll see. This neighborhood is going to turn into a disaster." But no one was listening anymore. Karen Reed's reign of terror was over. It was a Saturday morning when the nightmare reached its breaking point. I had barely woken up when I heard the rumbling of heavy machinery outside my window. The ground shook as an excavator pulled into my driveway. I rushed out in a panic, still in my pajamas, and what I saw made my stomach drop. There, in front of my house, was Karen, standing with her arms crossed, watching with a sickening smile as workers set up to demolish my guest house. "Stop right there," I shouted, rushing towards the machine. My voice echoed through the neighborhood. Karen turned around slowly, flashing me that same fake smile she always had. "Oh, Ethan, you're just in time. This structure is coming down," she said with a smirk. I felt a surge of rage. You can't do this. This house is legally mine, Karen. It was built with all the proper permits. I could barely control my anger. She tilted her head, clearly enjoying this. Oh, I know, Ethan. But the board has decided, and I'm just doing my job, she said, her tone dripping with condescension. I could feel the blood rushing to my face. This is illegal. You don't have the authority to do this. You've gone too far. Karen didn't flinch. Oh, I think I do. You've been given ample notice. The board's decision is final, she said dismissively. As I stood there, staring at the excavator, something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to let her get away with this. I pulled out my phone and started recording the situation. I'm Ethan Davis, the legal owner of this property, and I do not authorize any demolition, I said loudly, hoping to make it clear that this was a battle I wasn't going to lose. The workers looked at each other uncomfortably, unsure of what to do. I could see them flipping through papers, probably trying to figure out if they had been given the right to destroy my property. But I knew something they didn't. Karen had no legal standing. Karen, this isn't just an HOA matter. This is fraud and harassment, I shouted, glaring at her. She scoffed, not even bothered. You can call the police, Ethan, but this is a civil matter, not criminal. We have the right to enforce the rules, she said, her voice rising in false confidence. I was furious. You're destroying my home. You don't have the right to do this. If you go through with this, I'll make sure you pay for it. My heart was pounding, but my mind was clear. There was only one person who could stop this madness. I didn't want to use my connections, but I had no choice. I picked up my phone and dialed Mark Johnson. The call rang a few times before he picked up, and I felt a rush of relief. Ethan, hey, how's that retrofit holding up? He asked, his voice warm and friendly. But I didn't have time for pleasantries. Actually, sir, I need your help, I said, my voice tight. There's an HOA president here trying to illegally demolish my guest house right now, with my parents inside. The police are calling it a civil matter, but this is fraud. She's gone too far. There was a pause on the other end. I could tell the Mark was listening carefully. Put me on speaker, he said, his tone changing to something much more serious. I did as he asked, holding the phone out so Karen and the workers could hear. This is Mark Johnson. His voice boomed across the yard. Who am I speaking with regarding this demolition? Karen froze. Her eyes widened in shock, and she quickly fumbled with her words. I'm Karen Reed, HOA president of Oak Estates, she stammered. I know Ethan Davis. He's a law-abiding citizen, and if he says this structure is legal, then I trust him. Mark Johnson continued, his voice now cold and authoritative. It's disturbing that a homeowners association would attempt to demolish a property without proper legal authority. Are you aware that this could constitute criminal property damage? Karen's face turned ghostly white. She was visibly shaking now. We have HOA authorization, she whispered. The words hit Karen like a ton of bricks. Her earlier confidence melted away as the reality of the situation began to sink in. She was caught. The crew, who had been standing by, now looked uncertain, glancing between Karen and me. Mark Johnson didn't stop there. I will be making a call to the county commissioner and the state attorney general's office to review this. I suggest you stop this demolition immediately. Yes, Mark, Karen whispered, defeated. There was no more arguing, no more pretending. The crew immediately started packing up their equipment, the foreman muttering under his breath about not getting paid enough for this. Karen stood frozen, her clipboard gripped tightly in her hands, her whole body stiff with tension. The silence that followed was thick. The weight of what had just happened was sinking in. I could see the workers leaving, walking away from the job they had no right to do. And Karen? She stood there, staring at the ground, her world crumbling around her. Within hours, the news had spread throughout the neighborhood. People began talking, sharing what had just happened. By the time evening came, there was an emergency HOA meeting scheduled. The community was in shock. Karen's overreach had finally been exposed, and people were beginning to see her for the manipulative tyrant she truly was. Neighbors who had previously been silent started speaking up, sharing their stories of harassment and unfair fines. One neighbor had been fined for having a small vegetable garden. Another had been harassed for installing a basketball hoop that was explicitly permitted by the HOA covenant. The community was waking up. They realized that Karen wasn't enforcing the rules for the benefit of the neighborhood. She was using her position to control people, intimidate them, and force them into submission. The following week, things moved quickly. The county commissioner launched an official investigation into Karen's actions. The state attorney general's office sent a representative to review how the HOA had been operating under her leadership. Karen's power was unraveling. At the emergency HOA meeting, the evidence piled up against her. Not only had she acted without board approval, but she had also fabricated documents, bullied residents, and harassed them for personal gain. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't need to embellish the truth. The facts were damning enough. I presented the legal status of my guest house, the fraudulent condemnation notice, and Karen's attempt to demolish my property illegally. The room was tense as Karen sat at the front, her face flushed with anger. She had no way to defend herself. When the board voted to remove her from the HOA, it was unanimous. Karen's reign of terror had finally come to an end, but her last words before storming out would haunt the community for weeks to come. "This isn't over," she hissed. "You'll all regret this. Just wait until Oak Estates turns into a junkyard with RVs and garden gnomes in every yard." But no one was listening anymore. Her threats fell on deaf ears as she left the meeting, defeated and humiliated. The real change was just beginning. Karen's smugness was gone, but the real damage she had caused was just beginning to surface. Within days of the emergency HOA meeting, the county commissioner had launched a full investigation into her actions. The state attorney general's office sent a representative to look into her practice of enforcing the rules selectively, targeting specific residents for petty violations while ignoring the serious infractions of her favorites. Neighbors who had suffered under her rule began to speak out. They shared their experiences of being fined for trivial things, a garden gnome here, a slightly overgrown bush there, while Karen's closest allies, people she had probably helped in some way, never received so much as a warning. It was like the whole neighborhood had been living under the thumb of an unjust ruler, and now they were ready to fight back. But Karen still refused to admit she had done anything wrong. Even when the evidence was piling up against her, she refused to back down. "I was just doing my job," she would say, her voice trembling with the weight of the lies she had built her authority on. But it was clear now, her job wasn't about fairness or protecting the community. It was about exerting power and control, manipulating rules to fit her personal agenda. The meeting after the investigation started was electric. Neighbors who had been afraid to speak out before now had the courage to share their stories. Mr. Taylor, a quiet man who lived 2 doors down from me, stood up first. "Karen fined me $500 for putting up a bird bath in my front yard," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "She told me it was an unsightly structure, but when her friend put up a ridiculous fountain that took up half their yard, she didn't even bat an eye." The crowd murmured, clearly enraged. Mrs. Carter, an elderly woman from across the street, was next. "I was fined for my garden gnome," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I've had that gnome for years, and suddenly it became a problem because Karen didn't like it. I was forced to remove it, and when I refused, she threatened me with more fines." The more people spoke, the clearer it became. Karen hadn't been enforcing rules. She had been using her position to bully, harass, and intimidate people who didn't fit her vision of a perfect neighborhood. And now, people were done being silent. I stood up, my heart racing. It was my turn to speak. "Karen's actions go beyond petty fines," I said, my voice cutting through the room. "She tried to illegally demolish my guest house, a structure that has been legally permitted for over 20 years. She's violated the law repeatedly, and now it's time to hold her accountable." When it was Karen's turn to speak, she barely even looked at the crowd. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with panic. She tried to stand tall, but it was clear that the weight of her actions was sinking in. "This is absurd," Karen shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. "I did what was best for this community. I was protecting property values." She looked around at the neighbors, trying to regain control, but the crowd was no longer intimidated. You didn't protect anything. I shot back, my anger boiling over. You ruined this neighborhood with your personal vendettas and your abuse of power. Karen took a shaky breath and tried to compose herself. I was just trying to make this place better, she insisted, but her words were hollow, and everyone could see it. The vice president of the HOA, who had been quiet up until now, finally spoke. Karen, you have gone too far. The evidence against you is overwhelming. You violated state laws, HOA rules, and you've been pocketing fines without proper accounting. Karen's face turned a deep shade of red, and her hands began to tremble. That's not true, she snapped, but it was clear that the walls were closing in around her. The truth was now out in the open, and Karen couldn't run from it any longer. The board voted unanimously to remove her from the HOA, and the legal consequences followed quickly. There was no turning back for her. The lawyer who represented the HOA stood up and delivered the final blow. Karen, we are pursuing legal action against you for fraud, harassment, and the misappropriation of funds. You will be held accountable for every penny you've taken from this community. Karen's expression was a mix of rage and disbelief. You can't do this, she shouted, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. She had been caught, and she knew it. I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction as I watched her crumble. This wasn't just about the guest house anymore. This was about every injustice she had inflicted on the people of Oak Estates. As Karen was escorted out of the meeting, she shot me one last venomous look. You'll regret this, she hissed, her voice filled with hate. I'll make sure of it. You all will see how Oak Estates falls apart without me. I didn't even respond. There was nothing left to say. Her threats had lost all their power. The people of Oak Estates were no longer afraid of her. The only thing left for Karen now was to face the consequences of her actions. The room was buzzing with energy as neighbors exchanged looks of relief and disbelief. It was over. Karen Reed, once the self-proclaimed queen of Oak Estates, was finished. The aftermath was a whirlwind. Legal action was swiftly taken, and Karen was forced to pay back the fines she had unjustly collected from residents. The HOA's finances were audited, and it was discovered that she had been siphoning off funds for her personal use. Her reign of terror had left a trail of destruction, but now it was time for the community to rebuild. At the next HOA meeting, a new board was elected. There were no more petty fines, no more ridiculous rules. The focus shifted from controlling residents to building a better, more supportive community. And as for Karen, her real estate business, which she had always bragged about, was ruined. When the news broke about her illegal actions, her reputation was destroyed. The irony wasn't lost on me. Karen, who had once prided herself on upholding standards, had been the one to tear this community apart. Now, the neighborhood was healing. Neighbors who had once been afraid to speak out were now coming together, sharing their stories and rebuilding their sense of community. The damage done by Karen was deep, but with her gone, Oak Estates was starting to feel like home again. It felt like the weight of the world had been lifted when Karen Reed was finally removed from the HOA board. The power she had so eagerly grasped for years was gone, and she was left to face the consequences of her actions. The neighborhood, which had been under her oppressive rule for so long, was starting to breathe again. But even though Karen had been ousted, the damage she caused lingered like a stain on the community. I remember when I saw Karen for the last time, storming out of the emergency meeting with a fury I had never seen before. She was red in the face, her hands shaking with anger. "You'll all regret this," she yelled, glaring at everyone who had voted her out. "I built this neighborhood, and you've just destroyed it." Her voice cracked as she stormed off, her high heels clicking angrily on the floor. I couldn't help but smirk. Karen had built nothing. She had only torn down people's peace of mind, violated their rights, and abused her position for her own gain. The community was better off without her. After Karen's departure, something amazing started to happen. The neighbors who had once been terrified of speaking out began to share their stories. It was like the floodgates had opened, and finally, they could speak the truth about the toxic environment Karen had created. I was shocked to hear some of their stories. Mrs. Taylor, who had been too afraid to stand up to Karen before, told us how Karen had forced her to take down her daughter's playhouse for no reason. She said it wasn't in compliance with HOA standards. It was just a little wooden playhouse, for God's sake, Mrs. Taylor said, shaking her head in disbelief. Mr. Adams, a retired military man, shared how Karen had fined him multiple times for having a flagpole in his yard. She said it wasn't the right size, and that it made the neighborhood look too patriotic, he grumbled. Patriotic? This is America, for crying out loud. The more we talked, the angrier I got. How had we let this woman tear us down for so long? How had we let her manipulate us with her fake smiles and empty promises? As we began the difficult process of rebuilding our community, it became clear that we had a lot of work ahead of us. The HOA needed a complete overhaul. It couldn't just go back to the way it was. We had to rebuild it from the ground up with fairness, transparency, and accountability at its core. We started by electing a new board, but this time we made sure that every member represented the community fairly. No more yes men who would simply bow to Karen's whims. We needed leaders who understood the importance of fairness, who wouldn't let personal biases and vendettas cloud their judgment. It wasn't easy. People have been so afraid of speaking out for so long that they didn't know how to take charge. But slowly, one step at a time, we started to rebuild trust. We began holding open meetings where everyone could voice their concerns, where no one would be silenced. We even established a neighborhood task force to monitor HOA actions and ensure everything was above board. But not everyone was happy about the changes. Karen had a few loyal followers who weren't ready to let go of the old ways. They saw her as some kind of hero, someone who kept the neighborhood in line. They thought she had been too hard on us, but they didn't see the damage she had done. I'll never forget the confrontation I had with one of Karen's biggest supporters, Mrs. Harris. She cornered me in the grocery store, her face red with anger. You've ruined everything. You think you can just destroy everything Karen built? She spat at me. You've let this place go to hell, and you'll see. It's going to fall apart without her. I stood there, staring at her in disbelief. What exactly did Karen build, Mrs. Harris? A kingdom of fear? A place where everyone had to live in constant worry about being fined for things that didn't matter? She destroyed this place, not helped it. Mrs. Harris's eyes widened with shock, and for a moment, she looked like she might cry. But then she sneered. You'll regret this, she hissed, before turning on her heels and walking away. Despite the backlash from Karen's supporters, the majority of the neighborhood stood strong. People who had been afraid to speak up for years were now coming together to make sure something like this never happened again. We started organizing neighborhood events like potlucks and movie nights to rebuild the sense of community that Karen had tried to tear apart. It was incredible to see how quickly things began to change. People started smiling again. Neighbors who had once avoided each other were now talking, helping one another, and building new friendships. The air felt lighter. People didn't walk around with that sense of dread hanging over their heads anymore. I remember the first community barbecue we held after Karen's departure. It was like a weight had been lifted. People were laughing, sharing food, and talking about everything from gardening tips to vacation plans. For the first time in a long time, Oak Estates felt like a real neighborhood again. Now that we had taken back control of our community, we knew that our work wasn't done. We had learned some hard lessons about the dangers of unchecked power, and we weren't about to let history repeat itself. We implemented new rules that would prevent another Karen from ever taking control again. Our HOA was now run by the residents, for the residents. We set up a new system for reviewing complaints and violations, making sure that everything was transparent and fair. No more secret fines or rules enforced just because someone didn't like the way things looked. I also made sure to share our story with others, speaking at HOA conferences and community meetings. I wanted people to know that they didn't have to live under the thumb of someone like Karen. If we could stand up to her, so could they. As the years passed, Oak Estates became a model for what a real community could look like. We weren't perfect, but we were strong, united, and most importantly, we had each other's backs. We had learned the hard way that sometimes the worst moments lead to the best changes. And in Oak Estates, we were living proof of that. Karen Reed had come and gone, but the community she tried to destroy had only grown stronger. It was a new dawn for Oak Estates, and the future looked brighter than ever.